The car stopped moving, but the engine kept running. Nobody spoke. The men inside could hear their own breathing, but nothing else, not even the city sounds that should have been there. October wind pressed against the windows. Manhattan existed somewhere outside, but it felt like another world. Inside the vehicle, there was only the sound of lungs pulling air and hearts working harder than they should. Salvatore Lucania sat in the back seat with blood running down his face and soaking through his shirt. His left eye was swelling shut. 3 knife wounds crossed his neck. 7 more opened across his back and shoulders. The deepest cut ran from his jaw to his throat, close enough to the carotid that any shift in angle would have ended everything right there. He was 29 years old, and his body was telling him he might not make it to 30. The driver kept looking at him through the rearview mirror. Another man in the passenger seat had turned completely around, staring like he was watching someone decide whether to drown or swim. Nobody was talking about hospitals. Nobody was talking about police. They were waiting to see what Lucania would say, because whatever he said next would determine whether this night became a legend or just another killing that newspapers covered for one day before moving on. Blood pooled on the leather seat. Lucania's breathing stayed even. His hands were in his lap, not pressed against the wounds. That stillness was what made the other men nervous. When someone gets stabbed 11 times and dumped on a beach, they're supposed to panic. They're supposed to beg. Lucania sat there like he was considering a business proposal, weighing options with the same calculation he used when deciding which docks to control or which politicians to buy. Staten Island Beach had been empty when they found him. Face down in the sand, throat cut, left for dead. The men who dumped him there had done their work with confidence. They'd taken their time. Every knife wound was meant to send a message, not just to Lucania, but to everyone who worked for him, everyone who trusted him, everyone who thought Salvatore Lucania was untouchable. The message was clear: nobody is protected forever. Every empire has a weak point. Every boss eventually meets someone willing to take the risk. What the attackers hadn't counted on was Lucania's refusal to accept their conclusion. He'd walked from the beach to a road, flagged down a car, and now he was sitting in that car deciding whether to trust doctors, police, or nobody at all. The men who found him were neighborhood guys, the kind who recognized him instantly and understood that this moment wasn't just about saving a life. It was about watching power define itself. If Lucania went to a hospital, questions would follow. Police would show up. Names would be asked for. Detectives would push for details. The entire system of control that kept their world functioning depended on certain things never being said out loud, and a hospital room was exactly the kind of place where scared men started talking. The driver finally spoke. His voice was careful, the way people talk when they know the wrong word can change everything. "You need stitches. You need a doctor. You're losing a lot of blood." Lucania's good eye opened wider. His voice came out steady, no tremor, no hesitation. "Take me home." The man in the passenger seat leaned forward. "Charlie, listen to me. You don't go to a hospital right now. You might not make it through the night. I said, take me home." There was no anger in his tone, no defiance, just absolute certainty that the conversation was over. The driver looked at the passenger looked back, and they both understood they were witnessing something that would be repeated in 100 different rooms over the next 20 years. Salvatore Lucania was choosing the system over survival. He was betting his life that his reputation for silence mattered more than medical care. If he showed up at a hospital with 11 stab wounds and no explanation, people would call him weak. They'd say he couldn't protect himself. They'd say he folded under pressure. Every enemy he'd ever made would see that moment as proof that Lucania could be broken, could be scared, could be forced to talk. But if he refused treatment, if he walked away from help and survived anyway, the story would become myth. People would say Lucania got stabbed 11 times and didn't even care. They'd say he walked off a beach with his throat cut and went home like it was nothing. That story was worth more than stitches. That story was worth bleeding through the night. That story would make men too afraid to try again. The car started moving. The driver knew where to go without asking for directions. Lucania's apartment wasn't far. The city was dark. Streets were empty. Every red light felt like it lasted too long. The man in the passenger seat kept watching Lucania's breathing, counting seconds between inhales, trying to calculate how much blood a body could lose before decisions stopped mattering. They pulled up to a brownstone on the Upper East Side. The building was nicer than what most bootleggers could afford, but Lucania had been careful with money. He didn't buy attention. He bought silence. The driver helped him out of the car, then stopped, unsure if touching him was showing respect or disrespect. Lucania waved him off and walked to the door on his own. His steps were measured. His back stayed straight. Anyone watching from a window would have seen a man coming home late from work, nothing more. Inside the apartment, he locked the door and didn't turn on the lights. The wounds needed cleaning, but he didn't trust doctors, and he didn't trust hospitals. He trusted himself. He filled a sink with hot water, found a clean towel, and started washing blood away from his face and neck. The cuts weren't as deep as they felt. The attackers had been thorough but not precise. They'd wanted him to suffer, not to die instantly. That miscalculation was the only reason he was still standing. He pressed the towel against his throat and watched himself in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back was already different. Swelling had turned his features into something unrecognizable. By morning, he'd looked like someone who lost a fight. By the end of the week, he'd looked like someone who survived one. The difference mattered. Losing meant submission. Surviving meant will. People remembered survival. People feared will. The men who'd stabbed him were probably celebrating. They'd driven back into Manhattan, convinced the problem was solved. Salvatore Lucania was bleeding out on a beach somewhere, and by morning the newspapers would carry the story. Another gangster found dead, another power vacuum opening up, another chance for ambitious men to make their move. They were already planning their next steps, already imagining how the territory would be divided, already seeing themselves in the position Lucania used to occupy. What they didn't know was that Lucania wasn't just refusing medical help. He was refusing to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd succeeded. If he walked into a hospital, someone would talk. If someone talked, word would get out. If word got out, his attackers would know exactly how much damage they'd done. But if he disappeared, if he went silent, if nobody heard anything about hospitals or doctors or emergency rooms, then his attackers would spend the next days and weeks wondering if he was dead, alive, hiding, or planning. That uncertainty was a weapon. That silence was power. He knew who'd ordered the attack. The details didn't matter yet. Names could wait. Revenge could wait. Right now, what mattered was making sure everyone watching understood that Salvatore Lucania didn't break under pressure. Men who broke talked to police. Men who broke accepted help. Men who broke let other people save them. Lucania wasn't interested in being saved. He was interested in being feared. The towel turned red. He rinsed it and pressed it back against the wounds. The pain was constant but manageable. He'd been hurt before, though never like this. Every breath reminded him how close he'd come to dying. Every movement pulled stitches that didn't exist yet. His body wanted to collapse. His mind refused to let it. The body could fail. The reputation had to survive. By the time the sun came up, Lucania was still conscious. The bleeding had slowed. The wounds were cleaning themselves through sheer force of survival. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He sat in a chair by the window and watched the city wake up. Somewhere out there, men were waiting for news. Newspapers were preparing obituaries. Police were getting ready to investigate. None of them knew he was sitting in his apartment, alive, planning his next move. 3 days later, he walked into a social club on Mulberry Street. The men inside stopped talking when they saw him. His face was still swollen. His neck was wrapped in bandages he'd applied himself. He moved slowly, carefully, but he moved. Nobody asked what happened. Nobody asked who did it. Nobody offered help. They just stared. The silence in that room was the same silence that had filled the car when he refused medical treatment. It was the silence of men realizing that the rules they thought they understood had just been rewritten. Luciano sat down at a table and ordered coffee. His voice was rough but clear. He didn't explain himself. He didn't offer details. He just existed, visibly damaged but undeniably present. The message was obvious. You can stab me 11 times and I'll still show up for work. You can cut my throat and I'll still walk through your door. You can try to kill me and I'll refuse to acknowledge that you even came close. Within a week, everyone in their world knew the story. Salvatore Luciano had been kidnapped, beaten, stabbed repeatedly, and left for dead on a beach. He'd refused medical help. He'd refused to talk to police. He'd disappeared for 3 days, then walked back into public life like nothing had happened. The men who ordered the attack went silent. They'd wanted to eliminate a rival, and instead they'd created a legend. They'd wanted to show weakness, and instead they'd revealed strength. Every day Luciano stayed alive was proof that their plan had failed. The wounds healed slowly, scars formed across his neck and back, permanent reminders of the night someone tried to end him. But those scars became part of his reputation. When Luciano negotiated with other bosses, those scars were visible. When he made deals with politicians, those scars told a story. When younger men considered challenging him, those scars asked a question. If 11 stab wounds couldn't stop him, what makes you think you can? The refusal of medical help wasn't just about avoiding police. It was about defining power on his own terms. Hospitals represented weakness, dependence, vulnerability. Going home represented control. Treating himself represented self-sufficiency. Walking back into public life 3 days later represented inevitability. Luciano didn't survive the attack because he was lucky. He survived because he chose survival over safety, reputation over recovery, legend over logic. Years later, when Salvatore Luciano became Lucky Luciano and restructured the entire American underworld, people pointed to that night as the moment everything changed. Not because of the attack itself, but because of what his response revealed. The men who tried to kill him had operated under old rules. They believed violence solved problems. They believed elimination created opportunity. Luciano proved them wrong. He showed that power wasn't about who could hurt who. It was about who could endure, who could outlast, who could turn attempted murder into mythology. The attackers were never publicly identified. Luciano never said their names. He never filed a police report. He never sought obvious revenge. But within 2 years, the men suspected of ordering the attack had lost their territories, their influence and their protection. They didn't die dramatically. They just stopped mattering. Luciano's silence about what happened that night became more powerful than any testimony could have been. By refusing to name them, he denied them the significance of being his enemies. They became footnotes. He became legend. The scars on his neck stayed visible for the rest of his life. Photographers captured them. Reporters asked about them. Luciano never explained. He just smiled that half smile that made people nervous and changed the subject. The refusal to explain became its own answer. The wounds proved someone had tried. The survival proved they'd failed. The silence proved Luciano controlled the narrative even when his throat had been cut. That October night in 1929 didn't just save Luciano's life. It defined a philosophy that would reshape organized crime in America. Power wasn't loud. Power was quiet. Power was walking away from a hospital with 11 stab wounds and trusting yourself more than you trusted doctors. Power was turning attempted murder into a story so compelling that people forgot to ask who was responsible. Power was making enemies terrified to try again, because if 11 knife wounds couldn't break you, nothing would. The men in the car that night never forgot what they witnessed. They told the story for decades. How Luciano sat there bleeding, completely calm, completely certain, completely unwilling to compromise his reputation for his survival. How he chose myth over medicine. How he bet everything on the belief that fear mattered more than stitches. And how he won that bet so completely that the men who tried to kill him spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, wondering when his silence would finally end.